This is Melburnia. I'm Lauren Williams. In the Melbourne suburb of Hawthorn, a mother is helped out by a tradie, getting her pram and her baby inside into the high floors of a B-class tram. As the doors swing closed and the familiar whir of the vehicle starts up, it lets the road know it's there with a ding. The sound and sight of a tram is so iconically Melbourne, it would be hard to imagine postcards of Flinders Street Station or the State Library without them. Melbourne has the largest tram network in the world, and although they are an icon, they are also a mundane part of life for 5 million Melburnians. The status of Melbourne as the cultural capital of Australia is no doubt abetted with the tram that seems to slip so nicely into a more bohemian, slightly European image. To a casual observer, it would seem that Melbourne is just uniquely well suited for trams. As one 1984 ad campaign put it,
while travelling in one of Melbourne's famous trams, you're marvelling at a convenient, safe and inexpensive public transport system and wonder why the town where you live hasn't got something like this.
Well, there's a good chance your city did have trams at one point.
That's voice of reporter Adam Dinvu.
Cities like Ballarat, Adelaide, Brisbane and Broken Hill had extensive tram networks that were all ripped up in the mid-20th century. Sydney, at one point, had the biggest tram network in the Southern Hemisphere, bigger even than Melbourne's. And much like these cities, there was a plan to rip up Melbourne's trams.
Cities first had horse-drawn trams, which later gave way to cable cars, which later gave way to electrified trams. They allowed people to travel distances greater than ever before, and people could now live further away than ever before, commuting into the city centre. Although the automobile did exist, for the first half of the 20th century, it proved too dangerous, disruptive, and experimental to garner mainstream adoption.
In 1939, General Motors sponsored the Futurama exhibit in the New York's World Fair.
And now we have arrived in this wonder world of 1960.
It depicted a vision of the far-flung future of 1960. Free from congestion or pedestrians, cars glided across expanses of highways that were nestled amongst modernist skyscrapers. For the next generation of Australian urban planners, private automobiles were the future of transport. And now, thanks to post-war prosperity, this was a future that was actually attainable for the average Australian. By the end of the 60s, it became apparent that what General Motors predicted had actually come true.
And now we see an enlarged section of 1960s express motorway. Traffic moves at unreduced rates of speed. Safe distance between cars is maintained by automatic radio control.
Well, some of it. Most families had a car, and some had as many cars as they had people qualified to drive them. With increasing demand, Victorian Premier Henry Bolte funded the 1969 Melbourne Transportation Plan, clearly influenced by the vision of the future promised by American traffic engineers. You can even see the Yank influence in the name. It was a transportation plan, rather than the much more Australian-sounding transport plan. It proposed allocating around $2 billion for new roads, while just a fraction of that for trams and trains. Melbourne today has the largest freeway network in Australia, and that's after many of the plan's recommended freeways were unable to be built after protests and community backlash.
This is a familiar story for those who know about the history of the automobile. Radical changes to cities spurred on by auto manufacturers, using the promise of freedom and convenience and new job opportunities and interconnectedness, eventually crashing into the reality of car dependency. Highways dividing communities, constant congestion, and car accidents so commonplace you can hardly call them accidents. Looking out from the middle of the century, it would seem Melbourne's tram network was next on the chopping block, soon to become an unremarkable speed bump in the history of the car, much like the tram networks of Sydney, Los Angeles, London, and every other Australian city. But, unlike the story in all those cities, Melbourne kept its trams, managing to hold on to some facet of the pre-automobile world. It would be easy to chalk this up to something unique about Melbourne's character, a special progressiveness that Brisbaneites and Sydney-siders simply lack. Or maybe it's a case of geographic determinism. Melbourne is, after all, a flat, temperate city with wide roads. But this myth-making ignores the political realities of urban planning.
In Berlin today, the scars of the Cold War are still visible in their infrastructure. The one circular tram network is now cut into a semicircle, as the Communist East elected to keep its trams and the capitalist West ripped them up in favour of buses. The list of the world's largest tram networks has no shortage of communist bloc cities. Leipzig, St. Petersburg, Budapest and Katowice all place highly. So it's strange then that Melbourne tops that list. But this is not the story of some secret Australian communist revolution. The story of Melbourne's tram network is one of compromise and knowing when to change and when to stay stubborn.
Today we think of the tramways as part of a unified network of public transport, provided as a government service. But in early years, each suburb would have their own disconnected tram board where they would be run at a profit. It was such a viable business, in fact, the trams had to compete against pirate buses, that is, bus services on the same lines as trams, arriving just before they would, and then speeding off once they had filled with the tram's prospective passengers. It wasn't until 1919 that the Melbourne and Metropolitan Tram Board was formed.
What the board did was consolidate all the small suburban bodies and try and fix up the messy patchwork of overwhelmed cable and electric trams that were previously running across the network. It wasn't until 1940 that electrification of the network was complete, as the Burke Street cable tram was replaced with a bus. Melbourne lagged behind the rest of the world in this regard. Even Sydney had mostly finished with electrification 30 years earlier.
In 1949, a military engineer and major general named Robert Risson was appointed to the head of the tram board. He was, from the accounts I've read of him, an incredibly stern man, and maybe it makes sense he was that way. He did fight against the Nazis in the Middle East and the Japanese in New Guinea. He said his military experience helped him greatly in running the trams board, which he, unsurprisingly, ran like a military regiment. He had a big moustache and would be seen wearing a Homburg hat as he caught the Toorak tram to work from his house in Burwood.
One story tells of the dispute between him and the tram union about the conservative uniforms the tram drivers were made to wear, even through the summer heat. To Risson, however, a uniform was a uniform. Another story comes just 5 months after becoming head of the board, where he faced a strike. After the workers lost £380,000 in wages, the men returned to work after 60 days at pre-strike conditions. The high regard that Risson was held in, and his tall, imposing stature, let him get away with certain things that other bureaucrats would have found difficult. At the height of Cold War tensions, he praised the comeback that trams were making in the USSR, calling it one of the most advanced technological nations in the world. Robert Risson certainly stood out in his defence of trams, especially during the post-war boom of the 1950s and 60s, as the car was the shiniest it would ever be. And it's in this turning point of history that most cities would decide whether to keep or abandon their networks. Sydney, 1961. Los Angeles, 1963. Geelong, 1956. But Risson still believed they were the most efficient people mover in a city like Melbourne, and to help win the public to his side, the Melbourne Metropolitan Tram Board created Citizen Tram.
All they do is cause congestion and block up the road.
But surely it's the other way around, Mr. Johnson. It's you who's blocking the tram.
Oh, that's not the point, old man. The roads belong to cars. If I had my way, I'd get rid of trams altogether.
All right, we'll give your recommendation a try. Now let's take the tram out of the picture. It certainly leaves a nice wide space. Ah, but we forgot. That tram was carrying 90 passengers, Mr. Johnson. How do we get those 90 passengers to work?
Simple, old man. Let them drive cars. Good heavens.
As the world was losing its trams, Risen used this opportunity to participate in some myth-making, stating simply that Melbourne is well suited for trams.
But, as stubborn as Risen would have seemed, he knew he had to make concessions as patronage started to fall. He closed trams in Ormond and Footscray, as well as buying 100 buses, which ended up being the only purchase the tram board made throughout the 1960s. Sir Robert Risen was effectively running a holding operation and was rarely able to get what he wanted. When shopping malls were en vogue, Risen failed to get a tram connection to Chadstone, which today is the biggest shopping centre in Australia and still doesn't have a transport connection.
He did seize one opportunity, as the buses that had replaced the last cable tram on Bourke Street were beginning to buckle under the pressure from the busy thoroughfare. In 1955, he was able to return trams to Bourke Street, now electrified, and prove to a sceptical public that trams had their place. We often like to attribute historical achievements to great men, and while Robert Risen certainly knew how to play the political game, it's just as easy to attribute Melbourne's trams to circumstance. If electrification of the network had been completed sooner, and if those electric trams had been given the time to become worn down and decrepit, would Melbourne have kept its trams? Although he retired from the board, there came one more serious attack on Melbourne's trams during Risen's lifetime.
By 1980, the car had planted itself firmly as the main method of transport in Melbourne, with new shopping centres and entire suburbs built with no tram or train access. Against this backdrop, Melbourne had entered a sharp decline.
Good evening, I'm John Gatfield. We've called this special program The Chips Are Down because at Channel 9 we believe Melbourne does face a crisis.
With a third of all manufacturing jobs leaving the city throughout the 70s, and another third leaving during the recession of 1982.
Our manufacturers are finding it increasingly difficult to compete with overseas imports in all these areas, and that means that factories close down.
The Liberal government was interested in cutting spending, and the public transport companies of Victoria had ceased turning a profit a long time ago. Free market liberalism was the fashion of the time, and the subsidies that these transport companies required went against that ideology. To give some context for the state of public transport in this era, my dad would get the train to school every day, and he told me about the Tate trains, which he knew as red rattlers, because they had these shaky wooden frames and red boxy design. And he went to high school in the 70s. This design of train was first deployed in the 1910s. It was evident to the politicians and the general public that something needed to change.
Transport Minister Rob McLennan commissioned Murray Loney to spearhead this change. Loney was a former executive at BHP, an Australian fossil fuel and mining company. This blatant conflict of interest was not lost on the general public, who would dub it the Looney Report.
To get things done, to cut through the red tape, and to get on with progress and development.
It has, as I said, enormous potential. It just needs to be given the right direction. It's not being given at the moment.
There's no doubt that Victoria's population, and therefore Melbourne's population, is going down.
There's a state of moaners the way they're going on at the present time. We've made them what they are.
I guess the bureaucracy and the problems associated with permits and developments.
Most of the trouble comes from the federal government, and I'm surprised. We've got a Prime Minister, we've got the...
The report, officially titled the Victorian Transport Study, asked the reader to look at the facts. The facts were that public transport had lost huge market share to private automobiles, and that the state-funded transport companies were making huge losses. All of this was being propped up by government intervention. If the 1969 report was flirting with the automobile, the 1980 Loney report leaned in for the kiss and reached underneath its shirt. The report recommended removing all regional rail except the Geelong-Melbourne corridor with buses, higher fares to help cover losses, reduced services, cutting weekend services and replacing them with buses, and the shutdown of many key tram routes. Public transport in every city exists as a network, and closing one line causes every other line to become less useful. This creates an inevitable cascade. If Looney's plan had come into effect, it would have likely resulted in the shutdown of every tramway in Melbourne. Now that the car had become a viable option, according to Looney, its domination of the roadways was natural, in a Darwinist kind of way. Looney was looking at the road like an unregulated market, the same way the politicians that commissioned his report looked at the economy.
In truth, the Looney report only served to galvanise support for the trams. By the time it had come out, people had seen the reality of traffic congestion playing out in other Australian cities. As Citizen Tram showed us, everyone who was once in a tram would now be forced into their own private car, clogging the roads even more.
Good heavens!
In 1971, the Minister for Transport had said that he had his doubts about the future of trams a few years ago, but no longer. They were proving their worth in moving people in the mass. With regular AFL games in Melbourne, the public got first-hand experience with the efficiency of trams, moving people in and out of stadiums. And again, with the Melbourne 1956 Olympics, shipping tourists from hotels to stadiums.
It also saw solidarity between the unions, the tram board, and the passengers, who were often at odds. Conductors on many regional journeys would refuse to accept fares, and when one regional line was officially shut down, the passengers that showed up expecting a bus were surprised to find the drivers and conductors continuing to operate it. Unlike many American cities, public transport in Melbourne enjoyed cross-class support. Middle-class professionals would elect to use a tram over their automobile, joined by public and private school students and those who could not afford a car. For Melbourne, the Looney report proved to be ridiculous, although the realities of a changing world were still there. As recommended by the Looney report, the St Kilda Railway shut down, as its patronage was in significant decline. However, instead of a bus, it was able to be saved in the form of a separated tramway, thanks to public support and protests.
Despite Melbourne's extensive tram and rail network, it's still one of the most car-dependent cities in Australia. As soon as you leave the dense historic core, the same dense core that let Major General Risson argue that trams were the most sensible method of transport, you are soon met with kilometres of suburban sprawl, only rivalled by American cities. 50% of all new dwellings are in the urban fringe, areas that were previously farmland where there is little to no public transport. And as Melbourne's housing prices become some of the most expensive in the world, public transport availability increasingly correlates with wealth. For many Melburnians, trams are not a part of their local vernacular, and efforts to encourage tram use, like removing on-street parking and pedestrianising streets, are met with constant resistance. Even through all this doom and gloom, the fact that Melbourne has kept the trams have placed it in an excellent position for people to live car-free or car-light. It's clear that the political battles that defined the future of trams in the 20th century have not ceased, and although it's been made clear that trams are not going anywhere, making sure they remain useful and well-maintained is still going to continue to be a struggle. To quote Sir Robert Risson himself, "Nothing in the world stands still, and if it did, it would wither. It either goes forwards or backwards."
I'd like to thank the Melbourne Tram Museum for being an amazing resource. Without them, the research for this show would have been impossible. And thank you all for listening and sticking around to the end of the show. I've been Adam Dinvu, joined today by Lauren Williams from beautiful, freezing Melbourne, Australia.